Welcome to Off the Wire, the podcast that helps you curb cybersecurity risk and tackle technology challenges. I'm Tanner and I'm joined by Anthony. We're two IT executives with a combined 35 years of experience in the IT and cybersecurity field. Let's start the show. Welcome to Off the Wire podcast. I'm Tanner and I'm joined here by Anthony, and we're on episode 28. And this episode is going to focus on Microsoft 365 or Office 365. You can kind of go either way there, as we found out as we were doing our research. And we just want to kind of give you guys some tips, some tricks, whether you're going through a migration or potentially if you've been on Office 365 for a while, just some things to check in several different categories. But overall, Anthony, have you had a good Thanksgiving?
I had a great Thanksgiving. I had, way too much food, but it was good. I got to hang out with family and friends, and we, also decided to buy a washer and dryer for my mother and father-in-law, and when we went to roll it out, we found out their floor was rotten, and, me and my brother-in-law have gutted the floor and got a new floor down, but we got a little bit of sheetrock to put up. But anyways, it was a really good Thanksgiving. I was just happy I got to spend so much time with my family and friends.
Yeah, that sounds good. I kind of heard people describe Thanksgiving kind of like a marathon, and definitely eating it definitely is. By the end, you're really tired of eating. You're just like, oh, not in anymore. Can't take another plate. But yeah, I had a good Thanksgiving as well. Good time with family, and tried to take some time to reflect on the things I'm thankful for, and one of those being this podcast and just having an opportunity to kind of speak about things that we're knowledgeable about and share that with other people. So jumping into the main segment, we wanted to kind of start with overall tips and then kind of work our way through some different applications, whether that's Exchange or SharePoint or things like that, and give some specific tips based on that. But kind of starting from an overall point of view, um, really speaking to the people that haven't made the jump yet. So maybe you still have all those on-premise applications. You're looking at this. You're trying to determine, where you might land, or you're considering doing this. One thing I would definitely suggest is to be sure that you kind of look at all the different hybrid architectures. And I think a lot of people, most people I would say, are probably using some sort of hybrid architecture. I know we are. And there are pros and cons to each type of hybrid architecture. So take a look at those. Make sure you either work yourself to research those and figure out the information about them, or work with a trusted vendor that has experience in this field, because that can really, depending on how you go, there can be some pretty major pros and cons depending on that hybrid architecture. And kind of right along with that is take a really good study into the licensing, because there's a ton of different license levels. We talked about ones in the pre-show, ones that are made for people that are out in the field, ones that are made for people in the office, different industries, different security levels, and how many security controls you want to have. There's also ones like the one we run, Business Premium. I think you guys are also getting ready to switch to Business Premium, that are limited to a certain amount of seats. So they're kind of really made for smaller companies or medium-sized companies. But take a really good look, and I think Microsoft does provide a pretty good, you kind of a matrix where you can actually go and look and see which things you get in each category. But again, I highly suggest, if you have a trusted vendor that can help you kind of talk about, the choices that other industries or other organizations that are similar to you have made. I think that also could be a good thing. Anthony, would you agree with those kinds of things?
Yeah, having a trusted vendor, I think, is a key item, and I really just didn't realize the importance to that. Not saying our old vendor wasn't a trusted vendor, but we spoke with a new one, and they brought to our eyes, that there's really not much of a reason for us to be on E3 licensing, and so we're getting ready to make the migration to Business Premium once that lapses. The If you're under 300 users, there's not much of a reason to have E3 over Business Premium. So, just in a nutshell, E3 you get 100 gig inbox. With Business Premium, you get 50 gig. None of our users are even close to 50 gig. And also with Business Premium, you get a few additional security features, add-ons that don't come with E3. So, anyways, always it's good to have a vendor that helps you audit, and you need to do that yourself. You'll find things, and sometimes licensing changes, and you may not need all the license. that you have. So you definitely need to look at that yourself, and also if you got a vendor, maybe they'll help you look at that as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, there's a lot of different things you could do. I mean, based on your different license level, you got to really check into what you're allowed to do. And kind of to Anthony's point, they do change. Like you can be on a certain license level, and then what you're allowed to do or what they give you access to can adjust itself. So you can't kind of sit on the laurels. You always kind of got to be looking in there because they'll add certain features. Um, One of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later is retention, specifically retention policies. But we had a interesting way. I think Anthony's got a really interesting way that they've gone about from a legal hold perspective because legal holds really does kind of push you into that premium versus I think the standard level, which is what we originally started at. But having that ability to do legal holds, but I think Anthony, you guys are using legal holds a pretty creative way that kind of relates to retention policies that we'll talk about later.
Yeah, the one thing that got brought up, and this was just kind of the way our business always ran, is all email is kept for so many years, and for like key employees, I believe it's 7 years, and for just regular employees, it's 3 years. But the thing is they want to keep the items that are deleted as well, and so we looked at legal hold for that. I believe you might be able to do that with retention. I'm not sure, but we actually use both. We use legal hold and retention policies. But you don't have to wait until someone's quitting or getting fired to do a legal hold. You can just apply it to all your employees up front if you want.
You some do some creative policies around with the retention policies. But one thing you kind of mentioned when we were talking about this beforehand was someone being malicious and actually trying to empty their deleted items or something like that. I'm not sure. Someone may have to correct us. One of our listeners may have to correct me, but I'm not sure you can do that with. You obviously you'd potentially have a backup you could roll to, but I don't know that you can do that with retention policies. So we talked about this with Microsoft 365 and how it changes, and I think because of that, obviously it changes how we do training. So I know for us, obviously, we have taken a look at kind of continuous training, actually looking at subscriptions. Just because 365 changes quite a lot, and it is something that's different. It's not, in some ways, it's similar to on-premise instances of these different applications, but there's quite a few differences specifically to it being in the cloud. So I would suggest, if you're gonna move to 365 or if you already are there, that you have some ongoing training. It's not good enough to just really get, like, one class in. I think it's something that, your staff may wanna check into, more often than that, just because of the changes, that get pushed out pretty regularly. We have a kind of a methodology we do where we, do an annual training, but we start everybody in July, and then we do half and half. Half of our employees, July, like let's say of this year, and then half July of next year. And that way everyone gets basically a year, a half of 2 different years to actually do training. And it helps us save a little bit of money. But that subscription is to all the 365 training that this company offers so that we can, if we're looking at a new feature or potentially there's something that changes, we can take a look at that.
For training in our perspective, for the IT side, we found that we prefer the YouTube training, like just the free training on YouTube, just looking at a category or a certain section. We've tried some of the paid for services, but we really just find there's just so many great instructors on YouTube that we utilize that quite a bit. Now, with the end users, I don't necessarily suggest that. For that, we partnered with our local community college initially for training. And then after that, really, we rolled it out right after doing training with a community college. And then for those that were interested, we did a lot of one-on-one training, just personal training and tips and tricks. And then also every once in a while, we'll cover the different Office 365 apps in our lunch and learn that we do.
That's also a good strategy. One thing I would also suggest is to follow the social media feeds of the different, like there'll be a SharePoint, there'll be a Teams, there'll be a probably an Exchange social media feed. It's usually really good to figure out when they're pushing updates that way. You can also follow. We've talked about subreddits before, but there's certain subreddits for all those same applications as well. So backup and retention is one of those things that Microsoft's a little sly with. They don't like come out and actually tell you, hey, you need to find a third party provider to back up 365, but you do need to have a separate solution. Well, let me take that back. You don't have to, but you're really running a lot of risk there. I highly recommend that you find a backup or backup solution specifically that will back up your 365 environment. Don't rely on Microsoft's redundancy. And if you have an existing backup provider like we have with Veeam, then they probably offer kind of an add-on or a module for that. I think you said that your provider also offered that.
Mhm.
Definitely highly recommend that you do something like that, so you have individual ability to actually, put back in an email that someone deleted or a file they might have deleted without having to worry about versioning or kind of looking into Microsoft's recycle bin, things like that.
Yeah, and I can't remember which episode we discussed this, but we've had incidents where we've accidentally deleted our own data. I think that's more likely to happen than I don't think Microsoft's gonna lose your data. You may delete your own data. And so we've done that and we've been able to recover. And for those, we're actually don't use our we use Rubrik for our main backups. I love Rubrik. I think it's one of the best systems out there and some of the best customer support out there. But I'm a cheapskate, and we didn't back up our Office 365 environment the first couple of years, and I just like living dangerously. Anyways, we bought a Synology device, and we were using that for our cameras. And I think I read it on Reddit or somewhere, but they have a free tool on all Synology devices to back up Office 365. So we've been using that. We've recovered 3 or 4 items from it. It works great. And if you got a Synology device, it's a free application.
That's a great option as well. And really, honestly, probably a Synology device and enough hard drives to actually back up your 365 probably is not very expensive, even if you don't have one. Couple kind of out of the box tips. As you move to 365, or if you're already there and you haven't thought about this, the more and more you put there, the more critical it becomes. I mean, you got a lot of critical communication paths. You got potentially OneDrive, SharePoint. They put a lot of information that may be critical to what your employees are doing. So because of that, highly recommend that you have several, at a minimum two, but hopefully more than two even, internet connections, because now you're more reliant on the cloud. So you need to have that robust internet foundation there. Also, there's a chance that there's outages that are out of your control. Where since this is a fully cloud service, now they do have SLAs, but there is potential for 365 to have issues. I haven't seen them have like a complete down situation, but I have seen them have like authentication issues. That's happened a couple times. It usually doesn't last for long, but it is a possibility. So you need to have a communications plan for your employees. So if something happens, you need to be able to let them know, like this that we're having an issue, and it's not necessarily with us, right? You need to have a specific communication plan for that. In addition, and this is especially true if you're using 365 for basically phones, internal chat like Teams, and also email, is you probably need to have a backup communication path. That can be something you pay for. It could be something like iMessage potentially, or several different other options. Because there's a potential that you have all those services down for whatever reason. Maybe it's an internet issue, maybe it's Microsoft issue, and you need to be able to communicate with other staff. Like I said, especially if you're using that for phone as well, which is something we're considering. Another kind of general tip is you need to really automate as much as you can with 365. They make it a lot easier to do that than in the past. So there's tools, scripting tools, Power Automate, and other options that can really make the onboarding, offboarding process, especially. We're going to talk a little bit about groups and their security section as well. All that process can be done much more hands off than you're probably used to. If you haven't done that, it is something you need to do. The way technology is going, we're getting more and more technology at every business and at every level. And if we don't figure out ways to make ourselves more efficient, then we're just going to run out of cycles, and we're not going to be able to do as much as we want to do or need to do for the business. And we talked about this. I'm not going to hit this too much more, but know what's in your tier. Depending on what license level you have, just know what you're offered. There might be a solution in your tier for something that you were going to pay somebody else for. So, just kind of have a good knowledge base of what you're allowed to do and what you're not. Any other kind of overall tips before we move to security, Anthony?
really just want to touch on that last item. There are just so many different applications in the Office 365 environment. There's a one that I really don't see people use a whole lot is Microsoft Lens. You can scan a receipt and it'll auto crop it and it makes it look, you know, it's very readable and it's nice and clean. But Microsoft Lens, it does the cropping with the photos and it also just push it to your OneDrive into your Microsoft Lens folder. So, anytime I have to get a receipt, I just open up Lens, do that, and automatically push it to my OneDrive. And a couple other tools. One you mentioned before, you guys use bookings. And then another thing is just Microsoft Forms. Microsoft Forms is a great tool, and we utilize that inside quite a bit.
Yeah, those are, some great points, and we'll hit on a couple of them in some of the other sections, but just know what you have. Several times we've thought about purchasing a particular application for a use case and come to find out we had something that would do it, or it was at least close to what we were looking for. So, looking at security specifically, so kind of moving from overall tips and tricks there to specific things that you need to be looking out for or make sure you have in place on the security front. And one of the first ones that um, came to mind is kind of around logging, right? And really logging in administrative access. So, if you can, and I know Anthony and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but if you can, you need to have admin accounts that have no other permissions, no other licenses attached, anything like that that would reduce the attack surface. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. You think it might be common sense, but it's basically saying don't be a normal user and an admin, right? Have an admin account that's kind of set aside and different from that, which everyone really should be doing at this point. Another one is around logs and making sure that you have Microsoft 365 audit log search enabled. This just helps centralize the logging from all the different programs and platforms, and it makes things a lot easier to search if you do have something malicious happen. Helps you really track that down and figure out what was touched and what might have been compromised.
Yeah, with logging, just to stress this, I met a FBI agent at the field office in Charlotte, and one of the things that he harped on was that have as much logging as possible and make sure you've got a separate copy of it. He said if they're going to help you or assist you, they need to have access to those log files. So can't stress the importance of that enough. A couple other things I would mention is you need to I feel like this is a no-brainer at this point, but you have to mandate two-factor authentication, and I've only seen, like I think I've seen 2 incidents where Microsoft 365, basically people's accounts got hacked, and what the cause was is they 1, they didn't have two-factor, and 2, their global admin account was also the user account. So, just either of those, like, that's the only incidents I've ever seen with Microsoft 365, well, at least, any major incidents. So, make sure you've got that. And I know a lot of us use Duo, and it's not very costly product. There's nothing wrong with Microsoft Authenticator. If you're not using the advanced features of Duo, honestly, you're kinda wasting your money, and Microsoft Authenticator may do the job for you. Uh, the other thing I would mention is set up conditional access policies. And, just a bare minimum, I would set up geo blocking, especially if you don't operate outside the United States. So basically, we've got whitelisted the United States and Canada. Everything else gets blocked, and that's just geo blocking. It's an easy thing to just to help prevent the script kiddies from trying to get into your system. And then one last item I wanted to mention was CISA. They provide a tool for cloud environments. They do it for Google and they also do it for Microsoft 365. It's called Scuba. So Google CISA Scuba and take a look at that. But basically, you'll run that. It's real quick to run, and some of it you'll have to manually run, but for the most part, it'll go through and automate and show you all the securities, do's and don'ts that you have enabled or disabled with your environment.
Yeah, kind of along with that, Anthony had a episode before I joined the podcast talking about CIS framework. And CIS also offers a Microsoft 365 Foundations benchmark. So it's free. You just throw in your email and what company you're with and that kind of thing, and they'll send you a PDF that basically has a list of like all these different things to check, and it gets pretty detailed. I mean, it'll go down into every single type of thing that hardening a policy that they recommend. A few of the things that I thought I would just kind of share as examples, something like not syncing your administrative accounts with any on-premise directories, making sure you're limiting attack service when you have a hybrid environment, having what they call emergency break glass accounts that have admin access in the case that you're locked out or some sort of emergency. So there's a couple things from that, and there's honestly probably 80 to 100 things that they suggest, maybe even more than that. That's a great free source as well. And kind of, I'll just briefly repeat what I said earlier from a security angle. You could have a cyber attack on either your tenant or Microsoft could have a cyber attack on their instance of 365. So again, have a backup communication path in place, especially if you have phone, internal chat, email, all with Microsoft, then there's potential for you not to have a channel to communicate with in the event of a cyber attack. So I just want to stress that again. All right, so moving to Outlook and Exchange, we kind of combine these together. A few things I wanted to bring up. One, make sure you have safe links on. Safe links is basically Microsoft's ability to um, basically automatically scan any links that are shared either through email in this case or also through Teams as well. Um, ensure that your safe attachments policy is enabled. Again, same sort of thing, scanning through email, making sure that any attachments are not malicious. And hopefully, the idea is it's going to prevent malicious email or attachment from being delivered. We know it's not going to be 100% accurate, but every little bit helps. And then another thing was make sure mailbox auditing is enabled. Again, you're going to see this throughout as we talk about this, but making sure logging is turned on helps you figure out, what has been compromised or what has been touched if there is a compromise. It's critical. Anthony mentioned it earlier. That's what law enforcement's going to want you to have as well as they help you. I'm sure third party cyber forensics firms are going to want the same thing. So everywhere you can have logging, you should never really underlog. You should always overlog. So make sure that is on as well.
One thing, this isn't really Office 365 specific, but shared mailboxes or distribution groups. Make sure that your end users know that it's easy for your department to create those and for them to use it. We've had the last couple years we've had turnover and we've had individual emails, the user's email address tied to applications and tied to forms, and we've found it, be a royal pain in the butt. Also, some of the licensing was tied to those email addresses, and a lot of times it was discovered, well after we've disabled the accounts. So set up distribution groups and let your folks know that you can create those with ease. Another thing is a lot of us, we use know before. Know before has the phishing alert button tab, and that's a great tool. So it'll pop up in Outlook. You can view it in Outlook on the desktop and Outlook on your mobile device. And we've even got ours set up to where when the end users report a phishing email, it automatically creates a ticket in our ticketing system. So that's a good thing. And that's something we cover every single year for our end users is for them how to report a phishing email. And one last item, and this is really for all of Office 365, but make sure your end users know about office.com. I've said it a million times, and I always tell them if you're on a computer that's not your normal computer and you want access to all of your stuff, go to office.com and sign in, and you'll have all your applications.
Those are some great points. Really highly recommend the point you made about using groups or distribution list for either setting permissions or a lot of cases we'll use it for all of our licensing and renewals. So that we have several of us in that group. That way, if someone's on vacation and there's a critical renewal that comes in, someone else can take care of it. So highly recommend that. A couple other short tips with Exchange before we move on. Make sure you know the recovery options in Exchange, and that includes like specifically inside of Exchange, but also your backup, whichever backup solution you decide to use. Make sure you've tested that and verified the recovery for that. And this is kind of an Outlook thing, and it's really been this way even when there was Exchange on premise, but nobody on, or it seems like nobody notices this, but there's delayed delivery features in Outlook and Exchange. A lot of people don't know about that, and it can be handy. Don't think it's something you use every day, but I have used it several times, especially when I'm leaving on vacation to kind of pop something up to someone's mailbox, the top of their mailbox on Monday morning, instead of just sending it to them right as I leave and then it getting buried over the weekend. So that's another option or another feature that you need to take a look at. All right. So moving on to Teams. Gonna hit this again. Make sure Save Links is on. This applies to both Teams and Outlook as well. So scanning those links that you may be being sent inside your internal chat. Um, Teams, the Teams part of Teams itself, which honestly it's not the best naming scheme. It's very confusing sometimes. But in Teams, you have basically chats, and then you have Teams. Teams being kind of groups that you have, that are more that are going to stay over and over. They're kind of consistent groups versus more temporary groups. They can be set up with departments. We set them up mostly that way. And then inside of those teams, you can have channels for different projects or different subgroups within departments. For example, we have one with our applications team, one with our infrastructure team, so that they can have separate discussions in each of those without kind of flooding the other. The nice thing about those is they offer really, it's not just discussions. You think of Teams as a chat client, but it offers a file storage system. It offers several other different things. And what we have done is we've actually used that as a way to have shared drives. So we create a department team. And then in that department team, we show them where the files is inside Teams. In the reality, this is SharePoint on the back end, and I know you're going to hit when we get to SharePoint, you're going to hit a lot about this as well. But you can use actually Windows to, or not really sync, but do a shortcut to that location within File Explorer. So when someone clicks on it, it shows what it looks like their department. It's their department's team, and they can drop files in there, and they can co-edit files and all the same things, because it is much kind of a SharePoint behind the scenes. So that's one way to do shared drives. There's one way that we feel that we're kind of going that way. And Anthony's going to talk about SharePoint a little bit later.
Yeah, for teams, one thing that's great is everyone is moving on Teams. There's just so many different organizations on Microsoft Teams. The bad part is now it's being targeted by the bad actors. So if you haven't already, I would definitely suggest that you only allow external communications with whitelisted domains. You want to just block anonymous domains from being able to communicate with your employees. So definitely do that. The other thing I was going to mention on Teams is you definitely want a retention policy on that. I, I know that Tanner and I differ on retention policy. With email, I like to keep everything, and I know Tanner's the opposite. I completely understand that. Uh, there's a lot of reasons to go both ways. But with Teams, that's one thing I definitely purge. We keep 90 days worth of data, and then we purge everything after that. The thing is, anytime you have a retention policy, or if you're archiving email, just make sure your end users are aware what those thresholds are. They need to be aware of that. And then last, I would say is with Teams, you're allowed to add a lot of different applications. You might want to consider locking that down. I haven't really seen any malicious apps available, but we lock it down and they just have to do a request. Now, once they do a request, we see it in the Teams management application, and we can approve those. And honestly, we don't have a whole lot of end users trying to add applications to Teams. We mostly do it in IT, but that's just something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, that's really that makes sense. On the retention, yeah, you can go either way. I agree with just making sure your people know about that. We use kind of an 18th month retention. Our philosophy is most things are cyclical, and typically you're dealing with something kind of a year every single year. So it's not typical you're going back longer than that. And it was kind of a legal request just to keep, the amount of potential discovery down, which is reasonable. But you can obviously go the other way. You need to check on our policy on Teams messages though, because that could be something that we tighten up a little bit. I kind of agree with you on the apps. There are some really neat apps that add into Teams. One that we use a lot is polls. Polls basically, I mean, it's exactly what it says. Lets you create a poll, lets you kind of garner feedback from different people. You can make it anonymous or non-anonymous. So we use that quite a bit within our IT team. Other than that, there's not too many Teams applications that are used across the organization. I'll mention this again before we move on to OneDrive. Is you also can do delayed delivery in Teams. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but if you need to actually delay a Teams chat to go out at a certain time, you can do that. I believe it's a right click when you're going to send it after you've typed it up, but it may be a little bit different. It's been a little bit, it kind of, I don't use it a ton, but when I do, it seems like I have to kind of figure out how to do it again, if that makes sense. But it is can be a very useful feature. All right. So moving on OneDrive, we didn't have a ton of tips here for OneDrive, but we did have a few things we wanted to share with you. Kind of going back to Anthony's point on Teams itself, make sure you have a whitelist if you would like. I mean, you can implement a whitelist policy for your sharing in OneDrive, so you can only share with certain domains. That's something you may want to do. It can be a little tricky to do that if you have a lot of people working with a lot of different external organizations, but obviously we all know whitelist is the best strategy to have. So you try to do that if you possibly can. Make sure you're setting default expiration links for shared files, especially ones to anyone. You can set this from 1 to 730 days. So, highly recommend you do that maybe at 30, 60 days, because in reality, when you're sharing something with someone else, how often are they going back to that, a year from now and picking up that same one? But if they're compromised and someone's going through their email per se, then there's a lot of those links that you might have shared with particular companies. If you don't have that in place, they can click on them and access those files. So, highly recommend that. And again, kind of just in the same kind of line there as Exchange. Make sure you know the recovery options in OneDrive and make sure you've tested them with your backup solution and with the built-in stuff inside 365. Make sure you can restore individual documents, folders, all those kinds of things. You kind of want to make sure you do all that stuff before you actually have something important happen, because you don't want to be testing out your backup and your recovery procedures whenever someone has a critical document that is somehow missing.
Yeah, Tanner, he doesn't send me anything without an expiration date, so he definitely thinks I'm gonna get hacked soon. Just a couple of add-ons with OneDrive. One is, we just found this out, and it really has helped us out, and this is more just to stop from having an administrative headache, and that is to make sure that the OneDrive blue cloud is visible in your taskbar. So there's actually a group policy setting to where you can make that visible. So we've done that, and the reason you wanna do that is because if they're having an issue syncing files, like, the end user needs to be aware, and if it's not visibly in front of them, they're most likely not gonna know or find that out. So, definitely wanna do that. And the other thing is just really this goes with all of these applications. If you're sharing something with external users, just have a policy or at least work procedures, make sure everyone's aware of when and who and how they should share documents with. And for, like, OneDrive, we this is the only tool that we allow, sharing with external users, and, of course, we whitelist the domains that we allow, and outside of that, they really can't share any documents. So, we're gonna cover SharePoint, but that's one where, they can't share anything with an external entity in there. So, just have clear, defined policies on how you allow sharing.
There's one other thing I thought about kind of as you were speaking there that we've done, and I didn't get it on our list, but I'm glad I thought about it as you were speaking. You can, and this is something we do. You can actually set someone's OneDrive to sync locally. If you buy or if you spec computers that have large enough hard drives, then I highly recommend doing that setting. What it does is it allows all the files to be stored on the local computer and synced. Nice thing about that is you see a little bit of performance boost versus just being online only. And if someone gets in a situation, maybe they are out in the field or something like that, where they don't have internet connectivity, they can still get access to the files that they might need. The only downside that I will say to that, or like one big con, is if you have share computers. When I say share computers, just different people logging into a single computer, then that can potentially create an issue. We've seen this in some of our conference room computers where you might have 15, 20 different people logging in, and every single one is trying to sync the whole OneDrive. And while any one of those would definitely fit on that local hard drive, 15 together can fill it up and potentially cause issues. So on non-share computers, I think it's a great thing, but I think the setting is based on users, so you kind of have to take the pros with the cons if you're going to do that. But it's worked out well for us.
One other thing I thought about with OneDrive, and I forgot to mention it earlier, and this is a lot of this is really an awesome thing, is that you're allowed to you can on Android and iOS devices is you can sync your photos into OneDrive. So every time you take a photo, it's automatically going to move it over to OneDrive. So we have a lot of field employees that use iPads and they're taking pictures for storms and events, and they can automatically push that to their OneDrive and they've got a backup of it. So just make sure your end users are aware of that. That's a good feature.
All right, so moving on to SharePoint, and this is where I'm just going to turn the show over to Anthony. No, I have used SharePoint a little bit, but it isn't something that we use a lot of in our environment, and I know Anthony does. I know it's a good tool, and I'm sure he's got a lot of good tips for us.
Yeah, originally we had I'm gonna cringe when I say this, a WordPress intranet site, and I don't want anything WordPress on my network at all. I know there's hardened instances of it out there, but that's few and far between that you're gonna see. So we moved off of our intranet site over to SharePoint, and we didn't do this on the initial rollout, and that's something Tanner and I have discussed before. Is you just roll this out at your own pace. You don't have to do all the applications at once. You can start with Outlook and then go to Teams or whatever your preferences are. But SharePoint, we really didn't roll this out for 2 years after we did the initial migration. But, we did a lot of work and really love our SharePoint site. So one thing I want to mention, this is just because it was a big issue when we first went over to SharePoint, and that's versioning control. So for your Word, your Excel, and your PowerPoint docs, we have a lot of large PowerPoint docs where they can get well over a gig in size, and by default, it does 500 versions of that document. So if you have a 1 gig PowerPoint, that could be a 500 gig document after it gets up to 500 versions. So one thing that we did is we limit it to 100 versions, and that's typically been enough. I've never really had an issue where we went to recover a version and 100 wasn't enough. I wouldn't want to do less than that, but I feel like that's a good number. And then also what we do, and this isn't a whole lot of work, but annually what we'll do is for certain presentations that are very large, annually we'll go and we'll delete all the versions of those after we're well done with those documents. Delete all the previous versions, and then we'll check the item out so people can't modify it anymore. Another thing you want to, whether you're especially for those that are doing the migration, you really want to have a standard folder structure and permissions. you for us, for every single department has their own SharePoint site, and what we did is we set up a private folder and a public folder on the root of the documents. And for the private folder, only that department can see those documents, and they can also edit those. And then on the public folder, that's where the other departments can see. So if they want to share something, so if IT wants to share something with engineering, we would put it on our public folder, and all the other departments would be able to see those documents. They can't modify them, but they can view them. And you just want to be consistent with all of your folder structures that you do. Now what they do underneath those folders, I'm sure is utter chaos for some of those departments. But just at the basics, you want to do that so it's just easy for people to understand where to put things. And then also for groups, that's something you really gotta have a good grasp on. And one thing, we've got groups and we have very few exceptions for groups. And what'll happen is sometimes the end user, they'll want access to a specific site and they'll do a request. And unfortunately, because I need to make sure they're in a group, is I'll have to deny them because basically that's giving them individual access, and we don't want to do that. So we want to put them in groups. So we'll deny their request and just communicate with them. Hey, we're going to put you in this group. You'll have access after I make this change. So you definitely want to have groups. It's really just it would be a nightmare to administrate if you don't do your groups well. And then I mentioned external sharing. If you are sharing, make sure you're only doing it where you whitelist domains. But for us, and there's been a few times where it's been a headache where we don't allow sharing from SharePoint, but it's been few and far between. So just as long as you have a standard, that's what matters. Whether you're allowing sharing on SharePoint or not, it's not a big deal. Just as long as you have a standard. I definitely think you don't want to do anything without the domain whitelisting. Which the only time I've really ever ran into an issue with that is we have some people where they don't actually have a proper domain and they're using Gmail addresses. We're not going to whitelist Gmail. It's just that's where most of our phishing emails come from is Gmail. So for those, we have to find another method. Which honestly, I don't think we've really had anything that has forced that upon us. And then also, I want to talk about if you're going from file shares or map drives, you're gonna have a lot of folks that they wanna work from the File Explorer, and honestly, I'm one of those people, I wanna work with File Explorer. One thing to note is you can do a sync. um, I'm not sure, and maybe I'd have to take a look back at this, but we had a lot of issues where people would sync a certain folder over to their computer, and what we did is we mapped a shortcut to OneDrive, and then we pinned that mapping on File Explorer so they can have access. So, and that the good thing about that, when it's mapped to their OneDrive or they have a shortcut to their OneDrive, they can every time they log into another computer, they can see those SharePoint folders on that as well. So that's just a tip for those that like File Explorer.
Yeah, there's some good tips, and we're definitely gonna take a look at SharePoint at some point. We have a good internet product that we use that's worked really well for us, and have gone pretty far down the road with that. But I think I'm a big believer in not really being settled in anything you choose. You should always kind of be curious about what's out there and what might be better. Those kinds of things. I did want to respond. One thing you mentioned that you kind of said you've let your users kind of make their own folder structure inside their department folders, and how that could get crazy. And yeah, that's true, 100%. But I think as IT people, a lot of times, one thing we don't do enough is to let people use the technology. Like, we set up the technology and we say, hey, this is how it's going to be. This is the structure it's going to have. It's going to be this standardized. And you get it to the point where people just don't really feel like using something. They just feel it's more like a formula than something that they could actually use and kind of work into how they like to do things, and kind of merge into their workflow. So we've, not always been that way, and it's something I've been trying to implement in the last few years. Is when we, deploy any type of software out there, we need to let people be creative and let them kind of work it into how they like to work, and don't really try to, fit people's, idea of how they like to run their departments into the product. Let them be creative, and so a lot of times I've learned some stuff from that. People, you'd be surprised what they can come up with when they don't have a lot of kind of overarching, I don't know, restrictions and or something like that on a product. So, highly, I just wanted to kind of, I guess I'll get off my soapbox now. But well, Anthony, another good episode. I thought this is kind of something that popped into our mind. I think we were actually saw a Reddit post about this, talking about a version of Outlook that was coming out in January, and basically how to keep people from getting it because a lot of people didn't like it. And that kind of sparked our thoughts about 365, and coming up with an episode of just some things that we do that we felt have been beneficial to us. Um, any final thoughts on 365?
Yeah, just be sure to I know everyone's strapped for time, but just take a visit and look at some of the applications that you're not aware of and see what they do. You may be surprised, and next time you go to buy a tool that you don't need to do it because Microsoft provides it. Sometimes they're not always the best fit, but a lot of times they are a good fit and will do the job that you need.
That's a great point. So we're grateful to all of our listeners. If you found today's episode helpful, be sure to subscribe, share, and drop us a review, especially that sharing point. If you find an episode that you really like, and you think that what we're doing here is beneficial, then try to share it with someone who you might think it might help. We'd also love to hear from you. Couple episodes back, we did a kind of a listener suggested episode on kind of account hygiene and cleaning up Active Directory, and so far it's been pretty successful. So, any additional episodes or just feedback or anything that you thought we didn't cover in this episode that you feel like we should have covered, something that we could push on social media throughout the week, reach out to us either on social media or at show@offthewirepodcast.com. Be happy to hear you and respond. And if you got some ideas for an episode you'd like to hear us cover, please reach out to us that way. We release episodes every other Monday. And until next time, this is Off the Wire.